One of my favorite things in TouchDesigner is how we can use textures to actually instance position. And we've all done this loads of times, but I want to talk today about this magical little thing that we've been calling a UV. What a UV allows us to do is essentially instance positions from 0 to 1 in a grid. And let's take a look at how that actually works. So in this texture that I have right here, if I view it as points, we can see that it's actually arranged these points into a grid. If I view it as a normalized split, what we can essentially see is it is two ramps. So one ramp is going from left to right, 0 to 1, and one is going top to bottom, 0 to 1. When we combine these together, we essentially get a grid. And when we instance that, this is the XY positions that we see. Now, there's not just one way to create a UV, which is why I think this is super cool. So the basic way that we can create a UV that I kind of go to the most is we create a ramp, we flip it on the bottom left-hand side, and then reorder. Reorder allows us to take multiple inputs and take that input and put it to an output. So in this case, I'm going to take this flipped ramp to my second inlet, and I'm going to say input 2. What we've seen quite a lot in tutorials is this is then transformed into 32-bit RG. Before we do that, let's view that as a visual. So this right now, because we have these offset sections in our UV, we've got our blue and our alpha, is basically not giving us something that's actually in a straight line. So what we can do is we could do 0, 1, and now we have a straight line. Alternatively, we could just set in our common tab the pixel format to 32-bit float RG, and we can see that flattens right out because we are no longer using those extra channels. Something that I kind of try and do is I try and center my UVs around this 0, 0 position rather than from the bottom left. This is because I like to use the camera in perspective mode, and if it's in the center, I can just zoom in and out. So for me to do this, I can simply just add in a math. And if I go to the Mult add page, I can take my pre-add to minus 0.5. And now we have something that's fully centered. If I press my H key, it's going to hit right in that center. We can then use this to instance and do all sorts of things. Sometimes I find that having things in 32-bit RG, though, isn't always the sort of the most optimal way of doing things, because essentially if I then start trying to bring in extra depth elements, sometimes there's a conflict if I'm working with a third depth channel. So I do have a parameter here that I've made as a component that essentially allows you to have things that are in 32-bit float RGBA and actually just has a little math thing that does some of this automatic math for you. The difference here is if I was, let's look at those points. The difference here is if I took this math and I disable all this stuff and did what I just showed you, that minus 0.5, what we'll see is that we have off-centered this on this additional channel because we've minus 0.5 from whatever our blue channel is. So now we're offset in depth. So to combat that, I play with the range to basically allow myself to create an offset. So if I look at my parent parameters here, I have this offset component that's all linked up. If I maneuver this, we can see that we're moving left and right and up and down, and I'm using that offset on the red and green ranges, meaning that I'm not taking 0.5 away from every value, just the two that I need to do. Some other ways that we can create a UV, we can think of this as basically a grid, right? So we can take a grid SOP, we can bring that out to a SOP2 in the chop section, and this is basically the data for that object. So we have all these rows and columns, and we could press A and look at the wireframe there. But what we want to do here is convert that to an image. So take that from the chop into Topland. We're given initially this string of pixels. We want to select RGB, or we could even go with RG, because we just want those two values. We will get an error. It's not really an error, it's just a warning saying that we're not using that B channel. In this case, that B channel is just 0. To actually stretch this out though, into something that might be more like the UV we are used to, we can lay out to fit to square. And now we can see that this is the same output. And we can also see that the offsetting of this, because our world space is set to 0, 0, let's do 0.5, 0.5 here, we can see that because our world space in our geometry is centered at 0, 0, we already have a UV in this centered position. Another way we could do this is using a GLSL. Let's find that. And going into the text for the GLSL pixel shader, let's delete this section. We can take the XY coordinates that are running through that shader by accessing the vuv.st, so v, small v, capital U and v.st. We're going to have the blue at 0 and the alpha at 1. And now this is going to give us a UV. If we wanted to go in and change that center point so it's moved around, we could just minus 0.5 from our XY positions. And then again, we get this output. So this is what, 3 ways of creating UVs. And I'm going to sort of order these a little bit nicer. And I'm going to take this basic one and I'm going to show you some things that we can do with our UV. I'm going to keep it as 2 textures here. So I want to show you a couple of fun things we can do with UVs outside of manipulating data that is point-based. I'll show you that too. But the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in a video device in. So we have some kind of image. It's me, hello. And what we're going to do is plug this into a remap. So a remap is kind of like a displace where we take a texture map that is essentially our coordinates. So if I plug this in, we're going to see that the image is the same. If I go ahead and do something like actually add in a displace, I'm going to take a small chunk of noise. I'm going to set it to RGBA. I'm going to turn it really far down. I'm going to set the period kind of high. I'm going to plug that into my displace here. I'm also going to turn my displace values down because it's going to be still manipulating that by quite a lot. So as I go in, we can see that I am manipulating those coordinates by changing my noise and my displace. So if I go through that and see that we have created this sort of warpy mirror effect. If I wanted to go in and displace this texture of, say, like a circle or something, that would be very, very easy and possible. Let's move this up. And let's turn the amplitude really high, so like 20. And we can see that we're affecting this grid. In more utilitarian cases though, what we could do if we wanted to just flip an image is we could translate this X and Y, because basically that map is flipping left and right or up and down. And we could do weird things with the flop. So this is basically to showcase that a UV or even like a noise position that is sampling a UV can basically allow you to remap various textures. So I think that is kind of like a very cool little thing. Something else we can do, and this isn't using an XY UV, but it's using the same logic of taking texture data and putting things in 3D space, is we can take things from our SOPs. We can take 3D images and objects and use these to position things. So let's say we'll start out with a sphere. I'm going to take that into Chopland. So we're going to just have the data of that sphere. And I'm going to drag that out into a top. And so this is just a process of converting from SOPs into chops, which then allows us basically to take that chop data and access it as an RGB image. So we can actually see how objects look as a texture. If I was to add a null, right click to view, press V for viewpoints, we can see that we have a layout of this circle. And likewise, I could actually make manipulations to that, right? Like I could add in a displace, put in a noise, and actually start displacing that. And obviously here we're working at kind of a different value scale, so things look a little bit different, but we can do some really interesting things by playing with sort of texture to data. Obviously we already have a noise chop, but we can explore different effects here. Or you could think about mashing up different shapes. Like I could take a torus. Oh, gotta go in chops here. Take a torus, and I'm also going to take, I don't know why I'm doing that, and I'm also going to take a tube, and I'm going to take that tube radius so it's more like a cone. And if I kind of did this process for these two folks and added in some kind of way of cutting between these, I'm just going to split my screen so I can see this output here. I'm going to hit H. So I'm going to be real simple about this. I'm going to create a rectangle. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust it for each of these so we each just get a quadrant. So I'll move that over, minus 0.25, minus 0.25. And we'll do 0.25 even, and minus 0.25. And then let's have one at the top, which is going to be, let's see, 0.25, 0.25. But then, actually you can have that as 0. And I actually want to stretch out that size to, I guess, 1. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to multiply each one of these. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to kind of layer these textures. I guess I don't even have to do that. I'm just going to bring it in and hit multiply. Let's make it easier for us. Multiply. Multiply. Oop. And let's comp these together. And we want this as an over. Let's plug that in there. And we can see that we get this sort of interesting output here. The thing that we're going to notice though is that each of these is outputting a slightly different resolution. We can see this one has 600, this one has 800, this one has 400. So let's try and make this more or less the same. We'll do 40 by 40. Let's see, for the torus, we'll do also 40 by 40. And for this, we'll do 40 by 40. So that's a little bit better now in terms of the kind of consistency of those points. Could also add in a blur to try and smooth things together a little bit more, just see what happens there. Essentially, it will just move into noise. But this technique allows you to sort of just think about how you might do interesting things with these kind of operators. Now, I'm not saying this is the most interesting thing that you could think of doing, but it kind of gives you a blueprint for how you might think about mashing things up. For example, we could bring in like an OBJ or something like that, and that could be added into the mashup. Here we see my messy computer. Let's bring that in, do the old SOP2. It's going to be a lot more data there. I'm going to bring that into a texture, RGB, fit to square. And in this case, I might change the resolution. Let's see what we got going on here. I'll just take my first chop 2 and I'll just say op chop 2 1 or 2 dot width dot height. So then it's a little bit more scaled. Let's see what happens if I bring this into this section here. We can kind of see that we're getting the outline of that layer. When you work with this stuff too, you're not constricted to just then keeping it in chops or tops. You can bring it back into whatever you like. So here I'm going to bring this back to this data structure. I'm going to select the whole image in crop full image, and I'm going to output as a single channel. Then if I want to output as a SOP and select RGB, I can now see what this looks like as a 3D object, kind of going back to that earlier sense of kind of perspective. And I can also take a layer. So if I take this sphere and plug that in, I'm ready to zoom for that. We can actually apply some of the logic of that over shape to how it's actually meshed together as well. So can kind of play around with these different things. Going back to maybe a less crazy underlying shape, we get this kind of interesting pattern here. And then you can combine you kind of like 3D and 2D outputs. Something else that we can really nicely do with these noise systems is they're a really nice vehicle for feedback. So let's take this centered UV and I'm going to add in a feedback loop. I'm going to do feedback. I'm going to say noise. And I want this noise to basically only add a very small amount to our particle system every time that we're instancing this, because we're going to use our UV as the grid of our particle system. So under output, I'm just going to say noise. I'm going to take down the amplitude to 0.001, really small, and our offset to 0. And I want monochrome off. We also want to just make sure we're plugging in both of the inlets to the noise from that feedback. I'm going to bring that out to an add. I'm going to take the feedback into that add also. We'll finish off this chain with a null, which I will drag back into my feedback. And before I start, I'm going to create a keyboard in, so we can reset that feedback. I'm going to view this as points, so we can see it over here. And let's now drag this back onto our feedback. So let's see what happens. So we can see we get this sort of flow field effect as we instance that addition and subtraction. And so that's really easy to do when we're starting from this grid. And this would work whatever kind of input we put into it. Likewise, if we took this section here that we're comping together. Gosh, I'm having trouble with my mousing today. So I would just plug that in there. And the cool thing about this is obviously right now we have offset this so it's around the center position. So I guess before I show you this last cool trick, let's just show you why that is kind of a useful thing. I'm going to make a simple render network. I'll do an add and I'll convert, and I'll plug that into a geo. I'll switch my add to points and my convert to particles per point. I'm then going to instance that, so turn instancing on. RGB. We'll take a render and a camera. Let's see if we got that, yeah. And also a point sprite. And I want to put that onto the geo. And finally an out. So when I hit my 1 key, we obviously get our particle system moving. The reason I like it in the center is obviously we can see it's automatically centered here. I can go in and out and just zoom using this FOV without having to think too much about it. If I was using this output, we can see that we have it centered around the bottom left of our 0, 0. So in terms of actually viewing this, I would flick to orthographic. Center, again, is thinking about 0, 0, so it's still offset. So we want to do bottom left. And then in this case, it would be 1. The scale would then be a little off though, because obviously you are now farther in the center. So for me, I just prefer working with that offset already implemented, so I can just zoom in and out as I please. The useful thing though is if I was to take in this 0 to 1 formatted output and run that through here, if I was to say plug that into a remap like we looked at earlier, we can actually do some interesting effects here in a sort of a pixel realm. I'm going to take in just my video. I'm going to come back into the scene. So plug that into the remap high and plug in this distortion texture. So now if I press 1, we get a nice sort of bleeding as that kind of comes through. So you can do interesting effects with this, and then you could bring that into, you know, other feedback pixel kind of things. Another little trick I like to do in this system is, rather than having any kind of thing that really stops the system, like a life parameter, which would be another thing that you could kind of do to reset these pixels, a very, very simple technique I like to use is a cross. And I just take the unaltered UV and put that into the cross. Then as that moves down a little bit, we get these additional distortions. Even if it's very low, it basically enables you to keep feeding in a little bit of your original frame, and that over time kind of keeps things fresh and sort of exciting. So let's try dragging it up a little bit more. You can also automate it. So this was a bit of a rambling video, but these are some of the things that I think are super cool about UVs and just texture positioning in general in TouchDesigner. And I hope you enjoyed it, and more soon. Patreon subscribers will have access to my sort of souped up special UV that I use a lot in my work. So you have this resolution, so you can change the scale on that UV. You can change the offset of the X and the Y, so you can move things around without having to go in and do any of that setup that we looked at. You also have this ability to translate, so essentially if you want to move things in sequence and it continues. Like if I just did an abs time dot seconds and spelled that correctly, I could keep moving things in a specific way. You have scale, so if you want to increase or decrease the size of your grid, it allows you to essentially mirror a bunch of stuff. Rotate the UV as well. Also looks interesting on the XY points. Bypass any of those textures. Let's go back to this. And then you have options like you can hold, you can zero, you can repeat, or you can mirror to create different outputs here.